And we're live. It is Friday, June 19th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. We are on time today. We are not late. It's one of those days that makes Washington in the summer. The air is heavy all day with the storm that we know is coming. If you hear thunder during the show, it is because that storm has finally arrived. The air is weighted down. It's gross out. And it's a reminder that it is June in Washington, which we have been in denial about, but we are in denial about no longer. How is it in Cape Cod, Kate?
Oh, summer's finally arrived, obviously, as I'm wearing like just my overalls. It's hot here and humid and it feels lovely. And I can finally feel like I can drink like rosé and not be freezing.
I was going to say like a mint julep.
I know I could have a I could gin and tonic. I mean, all the summer drinks, but like before that, it was like, I was genuinely very like attached to the scotch because it was cold every day. Anyways, yeah. Yes, Kathleen, thank you for coming.
Hi. You bet. Thanks for having me.
And you're calling in from Chicago.
I am, yes.
How's the weather in Chicago?
Same, hot and humid, and picking up again with more hot and humid, I think.
So, Kate, the monologue is yours today, as is the introduction.
Okay. So I was tempted, and I have to think about it a little more because I think I could do something truly clever with the prompt of mixed metaphors with a little bit of time, but I've been running around all day and busy. So instead, I'd kind of like to do a monologue in kind of the Mike Pesca tradition that brings us into the conversation. And we were kind of talking about it in the pregame show that we were doing on Zoom. But I think that there is something really fantastic about this weird kind of, a little bit dark coincidence between myself and Ben and Kathleen and all of the different things that we have decided to study and devote ourselves to in our lives, and the kind of the I don't know if you got pushed back, Kathleen, this is one of the questions I want to ask you, but kind of some of like the lack of kind of interest or people finding it to be a weird or esoteric topic or not really the thing that you wanted to study. I have gone through this with online speech, and which is obviously at the fore. Unfortunately, part of the reason the online speech is at the fore is because of the rise of kind of like white extremism and white supremacy, which is something that you have studied from a historical perspective and a political perspective for over actually, I don't know how long you're an assistant professor at Chicago, but I don't know how long that you've been studying this and how long you've kind of been on this beat, so to speak. And then Ben, what is your story really quickly?
What do you mean, what is my story?
What is the thing that you covered and you thought was super important and other people didn't think was going to be a thing?
Well, I think there's two. There's a bunch of them. But look, when I was 24, I got obsessed with an obscure institution of the federal government that nobody had ever heard of, which was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And I wrote the first, and I believe I'm still the only journalist who's ever been allowed inside the FISA court. And the reason I was allowed inside it, because no one had ever asked before, so they didn't have a rule against it. But when I went in and wrote about it, the Justice Department immediately adopted a rule saying nobody ever gets to go in again. And a crusty old Justice Department guy who did public affairs, John Russell, called me up and said, "Well, Wittes, you have the eternal exclusive." And that's, I never had any idea, obviously, that 9/11 was going to happen. I never had any idea that even that Wenho Lee was going to happen, much less that this was going to be something that the President of the United States was attacking the FBI over. But more generally, I would say the issue that kind of bit me in the ass and wouldn't let go was that a whole lot of the issues that I worked on went from being obscure, the obscure province of national security lawyers and me, to being the stuff of day-to-day news because of Donald Trump. And, that's from counterintelligence investigations to, Russian counterespionage to the control by the president of the instrumentalities of the Justice Department. I mean, these were things that were very obscure and not the stuff of day-to-day news. And then all of a sudden they became the stuff of the front page of the paper every day for years and years and years at a time. And that started for me with 9/11, but it has kind of continued and accelerated, and particularly since 2016. And the growth of lawfare is a reflection of that. We started lawfare that's not the royal we, I mean, the group of us that started lawfare started it as a technical guidance blog for practicing national security lawyers. And we never imagined that 15 million people a year would be accessing it for day-to-day news coverage. We never dreamed of that. And I think our guest today has a very similar intellectual and emotional trajectory of the wonky, narrow, off the news matters that she works on.
Yeah. And so with that, I'd love to introduce Kathleen Belew, who is an assistant professor at University of Chicago. And her book, Bring the War Home, is about kind of the white power movement and its paramilitary base operations, and kind of how it is very much just like any other military movement and any other social movement, and has this cohesive nature to it, something that we kind of I think are all a little bit chagrined that your thesis was so right, Kathleen. Couldn't you have gotten this one wrong? But thank you so much and you're a friend of Ada Palmer, who we love on In Lieu of Fun. She's amazing. And so welcome to the show, and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your story and how you started out like doing this research.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And I'm delighted to go to anywhere Ada tells me, but especially delighted to be here. So I kind of fell into this study in 2005 as a graduate student. I knew I wanted to do something about the big problem of unsolved reconciliation in the United States, which is to say that of all of the nations that have deeply ingrained systems and histories of white supremacy, the United States is one of the only ones that has never had a national truth and reconciliation process. And at that time, there wasn't even a real big effort toward revision of national memory either. This was before the National African American Museum, before the new lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama.
When was this specifically? Like what year?
2005.
Okay.
So I got into this looking at this little truth and reconciliation project in Greensboro, North Carolina, around a shooting by Klan and neo-Nazi gunmen of demonstrators at an anti-Klan rally. This happened in 1979. So right away, for a historian, this is late for this kind of an event. And also the victims confused me a lot, because we were talking about 4 white men, 1 African-American woman who were killed. And then the gunmen in this event were all acquitted of all charges in 2 trials, state and federal. And then there was a civil case later where they returned a very partial verdict. We can talk about that later. But the thing about this Truth Commission that really grabbed me was that, first of all, with no subpoena power, everybody wanted to show up to talk to this group. This is a completely NGO kind of activist Truth Commission. It didn't even have buy-in from the local city council. But everyone on both sides came to speak. And the thing that the perpetrators kept saying was something along the lines of, well, I killed communists in Vietnam, so why wouldn't I kill communists in the United States? And I couldn't get this idea out of my head, because it is a collapse of all kinds of different categories. It mixes up all kinds of enemies under one big umbrella of communism. It mixes up home time and or home front and battle front. it mixes up wartime and peacetime. And this sort of a collapse of distinction and the idea that everything at home suddenly was refracted through this idea of open and perpetual warfare, I just couldn't stop thinking about what that might mean. And it turns out in the archive of this movement, which is huge, that idea is through everything, including through a whole bunch of groups that most people thought of as distinct and unrelated. What I found was that a bunch of different groups, Klansmen, neo-Nazis, later on skinheads and militiamen, violent tax resistors, posse comitatus, a bunch of groups all had this same motivating ideology. And the surprise in the archive was we're all interconnected with deep social ties to one another, and with largely unstopped momentum across generations. I think the results of which we're starting to see today.
I mean, so this is, I think that this is kind of one of these things. So you start off in 2005 and you're studying this particular truth and reconciliation movement in Greensboro. And then where do you go from there? Were you in college? Were you already in your PhD? Were you searching for something? I always think it's interesting which way it goes, which is I started my PhD thinking I was going to do intellectual property and then ended up doing internet law. And on the one hand, I was still on my way to the PhD, but I was never going to become an intellectual property professor if I really was truthful about it. I wonder what was going on with you.
I wanted to do something more about reconciliation, and I ended up in this deep study of perpetrators. But no, this was the first or second year of my doctoral program in American Studies. And what happened after the TRC is I ended up going back into the historical archive even further and becoming what people in American Studies might recognize as more of a historian, which is to say more focused on a definable period of time with a more definable archive. And by the time I published it, it was what one professor described to me as counting as history because it was 25 years ago or further. That wasn't always clear that was going to be the case. And indeed, a lot of it comes into the present in ways that could be extended by other scholars. But so the next step is I found this essay collection by a Klan leader named Lieu, who's one of the most prolific writers in the movement in the 80s. He had a widely published essay collection called Essays of a Klansman that did a whole bunch of important work for the movement, and also that espoused in maybe the strongest narrative terms and the clearest version this idea I've just described to you of unending war and kind of the wrongness of war as a call to guerrilla warfare and race war at home. The Yale Library had that collection, which is a stroke of somebody collecting it and thinking it was important enough to have. They also happen to have the full run of Soldier of Fortune magazine from the 80s, which if you've never looked at it, is amazing as a cultural historian.
Love Soldier of Fortune magazine.
Holy moly. Yeah, just through it.
Oh my God.
Ben is very excited. I can tell that he's just bubbling with questions. He has so many things to ask you. So I will let him go after this, but keep going, Kathleen.
Yeah, it's just, if you look at Soldier of Fortune, it's immediately self-evident how all of these ideas show up in the mainstream and kind of where the permeable edge between extremism and culture is located. So the Soldier of Fortune magazines took me toward another sphere of this story, which is mercenaries who became kind of white power warriors in other countries, especially in Southern Africa and Central America, and then came home and militarized the movement here. Let's see, and then through the archive, so then I found the white power primary source repositories, and then I supplemented with a whole bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests through FBI, BATF, and DOJ sources, not the CIA, although I believe there are a ton of pertinent records there. But as they said, dear Mr. Belew, we cannot affirm or deny the existence of such records. Well, high intelligence there about Mr. Belew, but whatever. And then I finally got a grant for the trial records, which actually was the hardest part of what I had to get. They're extremely inaccessible. I bet your listeners are interested in this, but there's a divot in the late 80s and early 90s. And my opinion is that this has to do with the end of really good paper record and the beginning of online record keeping, where people knew the internet was coming, so they assumed things were being stored somewhere, but a ton of stuff just got shredded or called unimportant or called historically unimportant and just isn't accessible. And tons more is accessible, but only if you can pay per page calling records. So for instance, the case I needed to look at of a federal seditious conspiracy case in Arkansas ran, I think, like almost $3,000 just to look at it. So luckily I had a library grant to do that, and it's now available to other scholars through a CRL purchasing, but it's not, you know, it's not accessible. And of course their viewing windows have all closed because they had to fire the people who used to staff them.
So I have so many questions, I don't know where to start. But let me first of all start by saying that you should be writing for Lawfare as you explore these subjects. I mean, this is molten core what we do, and we should be in touch offline about how we can work together. Second thing I want to ask you about, when I was an editorial writer at the Washington Post years and years ago, I came across, this is now a known thing. It wasn't really a known thing then. The Tulsa City Council was exploring the question of the 21 Tulsa race riots and was appointing this commission to look at it. And I was, what caught my eye about it was that the Tulsa race riots, which was really, race riot is a wrong word for it. It was I think the proper word for it is a pogrom.
Yeah.
And
can someone explain the difference there?
Well, a race riot implies that a bunch of people kind of went nuts. A pogrom, which is a term from Jewish history, is an organized, to some degree, state-sponsored, violent, attack that was, on a town or a neighborhood that is designed to kill a lot of people and generate a lot of terror. But the Tulsa race riot in 21, which is now in the news for Trump-related reasons, what caught my eye about it originally, and there is somewhere a Washington Post editorial that generated from this concern, was that as I was reading about it, and I had never heard of it before, as most people had not, one of the things that caught my eye about it is that it was actually sparked by an editorial. And it was sparked by an editorial in the local Tulsa newspaper. I forget which one, maybe the Tulsa World or something. I'm going to, at the risk of being shocking, say the name of the editorial, which was "To Lynch a Nigger Tonight." And it was actually an editorial that called for this event, which then happened and caused the destruction of this entire neighborhood and the murder of a very large number of people. What so moved me about this is that at the time, I believe since a copy has been discovered, not a single copy of that editorial remains, because the people who were responsible for this had literally gone through and purged every copy of this episode, even on microfilm at the relevant Tulsa newspaper. The copy of this editorial had been literally cut out. So it had been a deliberate attempt to remove the history of this episode. And I, first of all, think a lot of people deserve a lot of credit for, in the face of that, having done incredible historical work to learn a great deal about this over the last 20 years. But secondly, I want to ask you about the challenges of being a modern historian of modern white supremacist movements, where they have this very complicated relationship with publicity, right? On the one hand, they want to get the message out, and on the other hand, they want to deny everything. And so talk about that. That I will, while you're talking, I will try to find a documentation for what I just said, but
yeah, sure.
Talk about that conflict between publicity and denial.
Well, first, I'd like to say that the Tulsa example is really interesting, first of all, because we've had this huge outpouring of public history and cultural retellings of that event. I mean, the Tulsa race riot is also the event that starts off that series Watchmen. And the depiction of the events are actually from historians who've worked on that event are remarkably accurate. It's an incredibly gutting scene to watch. And simply to reclaim it and retell it in that way in a popular format is miles away from the erasure that you've just described. I think that and you know, the power of the retelling is real, and we can see that it's real from all of the efforts to dissemble and to hide what has happened, right? There's been a lot of attention to this in Texas recently, where historians like Benjamin Johnson and Monica Martinez have been trying to get memorials placed to commemorate the victims of lynching there, most of whom were Mexican American. And there's been enormous pushback by local communities against things like highway markers, simply saying, here is the fact, this is the thing that happened in this place. I think when we have that kind of pushback, it's evidence that we have to have these community conversations about histories of racial violence. I mean, I don't see how we reconcile the big rifts in our national political life without those conversations and without those stories. Now, as to the question about the ethical frame of the project, I think what you're referring to is sort of the very real problem of, does writing a book about the white power movement, or does writing a newspaper story about the white power movement create the possibility for copycat attacks or bring people in to the movement
or normalize it?
Or normalize it, sure. I mean, we see a lot of stories that are problematic in this way. There was a one that got a lot of pushback in the New York Times that was sort of like a Nazi next door story about shopping for Tupperware and, you know, cooking spaghetti just like everyone else, right? Those stories, I think, first of all, generate from, well, let me set that aside for a second and say, for me, my hope is that telling the history of this movement will do more good than harm. I mean, I think that there is a very real risk to people talking about this, that it can be misused. There's one excellent journalistic account of a paramilitary group called The Order in the 1980s that was used by Timothy McVeigh in plotting the Oklahoma City bombing. I know this because McVeigh checked out a copy from the library in Arizona, and it was found in Kansas in the home of one of his co-conspirators because somebody told somebody to read it, right? As a scholar, that's an incredibly serious ethical problem and something I thought about a lot while writing the book. But here's the thing, this movement has gotten this far because society has so totally misunderstood it, and because the failure to confront it has been so complete and so transscalar, which is a word historians usually use to mean spreading across multiple dimensions of society. It's a
failure. Say that one more time. What was the word?
Transscalar. So It's not just a journalistic misunderstanding. It's not just that we don't have the right laws to prosecute it. It's not just that people aren't giving the right jury instructions. It's not just that we don't have a policy prohibiting armed and active duty military from being in these groups, right? It's all of those things at the same time. And that is to say that we have to, first of all, we have to have transscalar solutions across, sorry, I have new earbuds and they are falling out. We have to have solutions that reach across all of those different levels. But also with the movement that has gotten so far precisely through misunderstanding and nobody paying attention, that hasn't worked. We have to try something else. We are now generations into this movement, decades into this movement. And we haven't seen any kind of coherent social effort to stop it.
Yes. And I mean, I want to get into at some point, I do want to get into statues. I do want to get into like the idea of having like as a person who does research, as a person who's a historian, like you are, and I mean, like I'm just kind of an empiricist in kind of a broad sense. But like having how conflicted I am and like, and then also feel guilty about being, and like everything else, and I'm trying to work through, and we're all trying to work through. But that also, all of those things get into one of the reasons why I think that what you're describing has happened, the transcalar nature of this problem, which is that people, it is an ugly problem. It's an ugly thing to confront this type of behavior. There is a reason that they wore hoods. There was a reason that they were tried to be anonymous. It was, and I think that I think that there is when I took international law in law school, you go through Nuremberg and you do all of the different types of international criminal courts and the genocides that have happened, that they've prosecuted through the UN. And one of the, I was most kind of like fascinated with the ICC in Rwanda, which was, they have, and I'm sure you know about these, maybe I think I brought these up when we actually were on that panel, because I'm so in love with this idea, or like this idea of reconciliation of the Goikaka courts. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But like they had all, here comes the UN, and they bring all of this kind of, they build a big courthouse, and they build they build all of these kind of very Western ideals of how to deal with justice, how to deal with the fact that your next door neighbor raped and murdered your entire family, include, and you, and then and how to kind of come to grips with that. And like the answer for the UN was, here's this, we're giving you this shiny new court, we're going to appoint lawyers, everything else. But all of the communities ended up having these like truth and reconciliation is a shiny word for it, but they called them Wakaka courts, were basically like the communities would come together. The person would stand up and get like kind of screamed. The person, the neighbor who had been part of like this mass movement would get like, and then like pretty much their sentence was to serve the people and the person and the family members of the people that they had, transgressed and raped and murdered and killed and burned their homes. Their entire sentence was to serve those people for the rest of their lives. And I always thought that like, and then the community kind of moved forward through this. And I was just like, I mean, it just made sense to me in a very normative way why that would be the way that you move forward things. And I was like, that is just like, I almost feel like we're too, like, there's just too polite for that. Don't want to talk about that in the parlor room of your Victorian mansion. Don't want to kind of talk, like there's just, so anyways, I'm just curious what you think about that. And like kind of some of that, these alternative means of truth and reconciliation.
I'm very interested in that whole conversation. One thing that I think is important to understand too is that, so the public not wanting to take on the problem of white power activism is one component. Another major component though is that the public has been deliberately misled by these groups. So beginning in the early 1980s, white power was organizing using a strategy called leaderless resistance, which will be familiar to most people. It's basically self-styled terrorism. There's a lot of misunderstanding that says that they like stole this from Islamic fundamentalists. Actually, not the other direction, but a lot of people have used this kind of a strategy in asymmetrical warfare. What that is the idea that one or a few white power activists could carry out a common set of violent goals without direct communication with each other, without direct communication with another cell, without communication with movement leadership. And they designed this strategy because during the civil rights movement, a whole bunch of FBI agents had gotten into the Klan as undercover informants and had done a very good job in disrupting and messing stuff up, although perhaps not a good enough job. The other obvious thing that this did was make it difficult to prosecute leadership in court because you couldn't prove that anybody had given an order. You couldn't prove that anybody had said, go bomb a building, go kill this person. But the bigger legacy of this strategy, I would argue, is that what it did was effectively make the entire thing disappear from public understanding, such that what we get is a series of stories about lone wolf gunmen, a series of stories about a few bad apples or a few misguided people. We see broken events instead of one big problem motivated by the same ideology. And this is true right now too. So the way that we've talked about events like the Christchurch attack as an act of anti-Islamic violence, the shooting by Dylan Roof in Charleston of of worshipers as an anti-Black violent act, the Tree of Life shooting as an anti-Semitic violent act. They are all of those things. The El Paso shooting as an anti-Latino violent act, but they're also all white power movement. These are all attackers who are motivated by the same social movement and the same ideology. And they've given us a lot of clear information about believing that. So if we connect those stories, there's a possibility not only for understanding the white power movement, but for those communities coming together in common cause.
So I want to bring in Dan Byman, who is an esteemed terrorism scholar. And but before I do, it occurs to me that we haven't asked you to do something that we probably should have asked 20 minutes ago, which is talk about your book.
Oh, sure.
Like, what is you have a major book out on this subject. Walk us through what the project was, because that will actually set up Dan's question very well.
Sure. So the book is Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. And basically what it's doing is tracing the unification of these different groups: Klansmen, neo-Nazis, tax protesters, violent white supremacists, Christian identity believers, and others, into one cohesive movement. And the argument is sort of that the Vietnam War created an opportunity for these different groups to come together through a narrative about betrayal of the government, and also through the tactical weapons and expertise and paramilitary culture that gripped American culture more broadly in its aftermath. So what I'm doing is tracing those groups through the Oklahoma City bombing to show conclusively that that bombing is not the work of a lone wolf or a few bad apples, but is actually part of a wide-ranging social movement that was connected through, interpersonal relationships and marriages and childcare and all kinds of other soft mechanisms, as well as these violent plans.
And so when I think of the Oklahoma City bombing and its relationship to the white power movement, I think about the Turner Diaries as kind of the glue and the Turner Diaries, for those of you who don't know, is a text that imagines a kind of I don't know, a kind of leaderless Nazi resistance, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of imagines doing a lot of the things that Kathleen is talking about in the name of killing a lot of Jews and Blacks. How much richer is the fabric that gives rise to Tim McVeigh than that he reads the Turner Diaries and he's like, yeah, this is the shit, man?
I mean, that's part of it. But what we can also do is trace Timothy McVeigh's beliefs through his own actions and writings, and also observe through historical study his movements prior to the bombing. So we have conclusive evidence that he's connected to a whole bunch of different white power actors, ranging from the Michigan militia to separatist compounds at Elohim City and elsewhere. And there's a very persuasive sort of set of things he does that are not only coming from the Turner Diaries, which is absolutely right. As you say, he's using the book to structure his event, but also sort of employing other parts of the social movement. And I should just say too, before we move on, this is a social movement that is incredibly diverse in all ways other than race. It has multiple theologies. It has a whole bunch of different groups. It's in urban, suburban, and rural spaces. It's connected across the country in ways that are documented in the historical archive. And I think part of what we've missed about the Oklahoma City bombing, which is, by the way, the largest mass casualty event on American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11, is that it is part of this movement that we have never prosecuted. And there are reasons that we have never gotten that story into what I would argue is sort of our public history.
So Dan, for those of you who don't know Dan Byman, Dan is a professor at Georgetown. He's a close Brookings colleague of mine, and he's Lawfare's foreign policy editor, and he's a terrorism and Middle East scholar. So Dan, what's on your mind?
First of all, I'm excited to be talking to you. I love your book. It's just a fantastic piece of scholarship, and I was thrilled when Ben and Kate that you were going to be on the show. So I apologize for crashing a party. I just got excited and began to text Ben questions. One thing that I wondered as I was reading your book is that in the post 9/11 era, as you know, the US government focused very heavily on the threat of Islamist terrorism, including at home. And that was subsequently criticized as we saw various white supremacist attacks. During the time of your book, during the time of your research, I could tell two stories based on your book. One is, oh my God, the FBI, others did a great job going after these groups. They shattered the clans. They really were aggressive in putting informants in. They did a lot to go after these groups and took down a large number. The other is, given the scale of activities going on, they were really at best focused on the tip of the iceberg. How do you read it? Were they better then? Were they worse then? Were they missing a lot? Were they doing a good job? What's your take?
I'm always hesitant to sort of say like the FBI failed, because there were a lot of FBI agents doing heroic work on the ground in real time and without the benefit of hindsight, which I have as a historian, right? I mean, a lot of the ways that you're able to see the breadth of the activity I'm talking about in the book is through records and information and testimony that were not available at the time to agents on the ground or in DC. So there are FBI agents on the ground doing the incredibly difficult work of following these people, really tracking them down. There's this one guy, Jack Knox, who they tried to kill at one point, and who really spent his life's work trying to do this. But I mean, he, I believe, resigned in frustration because the FBI wasn't doing enough and didn't take it seriously enough. And I think the thing that was difficult to see at the time is how each of these flashpoint events were connected in this broader movement. So that is to say that I think what you could see at the time was sort of these moments that were, let me put it this way. Everything I talk about in Bring the War Home, the events of each chapter were known as they happened. Like the Greensboro shooting, that was a Saturday Night Live sketch. It was in the zeitgeist. People were aware it was happening. I also talk about things like the harassment by the Klan of Vietnamese refugee fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico on the Galveston Bay area. That made its way into a movie with Ed Harris or someone like that. These were covered in major newspapers. Reporters were also doing the heroic work of figuring out some of this that happened. But the national scope, that's the kind of information that we don't get until years later. And the transnational scope, I think we're only just now starting to dip a finger into how big and far this has gone. I'll say that I'd like to come back to how part of that is because we have not adequately studied the role of women in these groups. And I'll just flag that as something I'd like to come back to. But the FBI story, I think, comes down to this one major prosecution in 1987-88, where the FBI and DOJ and ATF and other groups were sort of putting a ton of resources into this big seditious conspiracy trial. Your listeners probably are aware of what this is, but I'm just going to explain in case people are coming in from Twitter or elsewhere that seditious conspiracy, the attempt was to show that some of the activists in this trial, and there were 13 people standing trial, they wanted to show that some of them had plotted to violently overthrow the government. Now, they were doing that. We can say as historians that they were plotting to violently overthrow the government. We know that they were doing that because they said they were doing that, because they were in constant communication with each other about how to do that. They had at this point robbed millions of dollars from armored cars in the Pacific Northwest, gone on a spree to distribute that money to groups across the country, with which those groups then bought computers and got online onto kind of proto-internet social networking sites to coordinate their activity. We know that they were outfitted with a ton of semi-automatic weapons, automatic weapons, machine guns, and also things like anti-tank rockets and homemade napalm and homemade claymore mines. We know that they were training in paramilitary warfare, including urban combat. So they were doing that. They were trying to do a seditious conspiracy. Whether they could do it turned out to be one of the questions, and we can come back to that if it's of interest. But what happened in this trial was just a cataclysmic failure from the perspective of the DOJ, I think, because a lot of things hampered the trial that I think reasonable people can agree are problems. So things like 2 of the jurors had romantic relationships with defendants. I think most people would think that that's not.
We frown on that. We frown on that generally.
We frown on that. I mean, that's not an impartial jury. I think we can agree. There were other problems like this. This trial was held in a region where there had been huge prosecutions of these groups in the past. So, and they excluded anyone who even knew what any of the groups were. So that means anyone who read the newspaper was excluded from the jury pool. They excluded a ton of evidence because of chain of custody problems, because one of the major people, Louis Beam, who I mentioned earlier, was apprehended in Mexico and they hadn't followed protocol. So everything he had, which included things like ID falsification kits, a medallion showing he was part of the order, that group that I talked about earlier, tons of stuff was excluded. And then white women were also doing this big performative activism about injured bodies and sort of like themselves as martyrs. So the picture that ran in one paper after the acquittal was of Beam carrying his wife, Sheila, in his arms in front of, excuse me, I believe in front of a Confederate memorial. And she's wearing this white dress. Her blonde hair is draped over his arm. For some reason, she has no shoes. It's like it's a scene that comes from something like Birth of a Nation more than a modern court reporting. And the headline was "Jubilant Racists Win Trial." So this was not a win for the DOJ, which had poured a ton of effort into this. I mean, a bunch of smaller prosecutions had set up things like plea bargain evidence that people were going to testify against their peers in the movement. And all of that was just lost. So after that, one journalist found a memo that said, after that, there was a policy in place that we are going to prosecute only individual actions tied to the white power movement. We are not going to try to show this as a movement, individual actors only. So that's the policy in place when McVeigh comes to trial. So the onus from the beginning, the thing that shapes the investigation and also the prosecution, is only one or a few actors, not the movement. Now, what would that prosecution have looked like if we had tried to look at the movement? I think we will never know, but I think we really missed an opportunity to confront domestic terrorism in that moment. And to confront this very wide-ranging movement. So when you look at the long haul, it's hard to argue that we, the United States, or the FBI has adequately responded to the threat. And I think that's also true going into the 2000s when resources, as we know, were overwhelmingly directed towards Islamic terror and away from white separatist groups and white power groups, even though the latter has been raking in far more casualties in recent years.
So I before we go on, I just want a quick correction on a couple of points. Somebody named David Kucinskis writes in on the YouTube page, Tulsa native, the newspaper that published the editorial was the Tulsa Tribune, which was owned by Richard Lloyd Jones, a cousin of Frank Lloyd Wright, who built him a house in Tulsa. There is still a small general aviation airport in Tulsa named after Lloyd Jones. I also, in my memory, made the headline of that editorial even more offensive than it actually was. The editorial was headlined, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." No articles. Kate, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So I just kind of really want to get into this idea of defining a social movement. Yeah. Which I think is like, not to be too dorky and like kind of academic about it, but like we've talked about social movements and like you're like, you know, I think that your book is transformative on this point. But I'm also very interested because, as you just said, you're like, there is the white supremacists, these racist groups are like unique only in that they are all the same race, right? Like that is like the only like the underlying thing. One of the things that I write a lot about is the good and the bad that has come with the internet and the ability to take a diaspora and consolidate it and to foster it and everything else. And that, like, so you have both like gay kids in Tulsa that like are growing up at 12 years old and feel like they have no community. They finally find a community and this is so great, and like message boards. So this is one of the great things about the internet. But then you have you have white supremacy.
Yeah.
And so I'm very curious, like, how you've parsed the internet in your modern American study of white supremacy, the role, like the way that groups and people have found each other despite having kind of these very decentralized kind of locations and decentralized geographically, like that it's almost enlivened, well, it has enlivened the extremist movements and allowed people to express their very dissident opinions in safe spaces.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the reasons that people haven't always described these groups as being part of a social movement has been along the lines of, oh, there's too much infighting. Oh, these people had feuds with each other. Oh, they don't all agree on what the outcome is going to be. And I think any historian of social movements will tell you, show me a movement where everyone has done those things. Because, I mean, any movement in the 20th century is characterized in the same way. If you look at the civil rights movement, for instance, and I am not equating these two movements in their moral authority in any way, but the civil rights movement had huge schisms about things like the use of violence, what the outcomes should be, the strategies that should be used in different cases, and had huge feuds between members. So too in the white power movement. The interesting thing about it is, I think, when people confront a ideology and a belief system that is so totally foreign, and I think that's the case for most people who are trying to describe the white power movement, I think there's a natural human impulse to want to sort of sort people into columns. So there's a lot of energy spent towards things like exactly which symbols go with skinheads, exactly which symbols go with Nazis, exactly which person is a leader of this ideology and which is that, like which slogan goes where, how many are in each column, et cetera, right? I think that's the wrong way to understand this, because for activists on the ground, that's simply not how they interacted with the movement at all. What we see is a lot of people having multiple affiliations, people circling through groups, people having a fight with somebody and moving to the next group over, people beginning in one group, marrying somebody else, and then going to that group instead, right? So people are moving through this as they live their lives. It's also incredibly ordinary to see sort of like the movement taking advantage of this flexibility. So at an event like the Aryan Nations World Congress, which was like the major convening event for the movement for the mid 80s, I'd say, they would burn a cross for the Klansmen, but they would also burn a swastika for the neo-Nazis and give sermons for the Christian identity people. And they would do all of the work of social movement making also. So it's not just political speeches. Maybe I'll just take these off. It's not just political speeches. It's also, can you still hear me?
Very well.
So it's also volleyball and a big spaghetti dinner and, like the young people meeting each other and maybe making couples, and childcare and shared rides from the airport. And all of those things form an incredibly durable base for this activism. Now, I think the other reason that we've missed this story is that the academy in general, and I think this is true of reporters too, has usually approached conservative women through the lens of a women's history and an idea of activism that comes from the left, which is to say, if I am trained as a women's studies or feminist studies scholar, or a historian more broadly, I might enter this movement and think like, oh, well, these women say they're not activists, so they're not activists. Or I might say, they're saying we don't want any part of leadership, so we're not really leading, right? But in the white power movement, as in the new right, it turns out that there's a ton of women's activism that just doesn't fit the mold of what we were looking for.
So what does it look like?
Kathleen, we're like the same person. So I spent like my senior history, modern American history thesis in college was on Phyllis Schlafly and Stop ERA. So that's like what it looks like in the most, not like in the most kind of like clean and mainstream sense.
Yes. And we are, for the record, I am not saying that the new right women's activism is the same thing as the white power movement. And I am not saying that. But what I am saying is that as in the new right, in the white power movement, we see a lot of things like women's quarterly magazines that are ostensibly just about homemaking, but also include a whole bunch of stuff about preparing for race war. Or we see women who are saying like, I'm not an activist, but who are running an auxiliary group that has a big membership and is actually doing a lot of stuff. Or
Kathleen,
women who are saying,
do you know that this still totally exists? Like the Pinterest pages are like, here's a bundt cake, and also like Barack Obama is a N-word. Like and they're all pinned on the same page. Like
you got to get Cynthia Miller-Idris in here to talk about the neo-Nazi cooking shows, because it's amazing. But all of this is to say, like, all of this is about using a social movement to create the space and the support structure for violent activism. And in this case, the activism it's supporting is profoundly scary and profoundly violent and anti-democratic, and is trying to bring about not just, social change, but it's trying to overthrow the country.
Lew, the floor is yours, but you got to unmute yourself.
Maybe if I close them.
Hi. So I've noticed there's a correlation between white supremacy and anti-government sentiment, and I'm wondering if you could make that a little bit more precise than just my vague observations. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Can you start that question over? I was not able to hear the beginning.
Yeah, so I've noticed a strong correlation between white supremacy and anti-government sentiment. And
yes, okay.
I was just wondering if you could say more beyond my casual observations.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, this kind of goes back to that post-Vietnam moment when betrayal by the government, the narrative of being betrayed and abandoned in Vietnam, became kind of the major uniting story that brought these activists together. Before that, groups like the Klan and groups like neo-Nazis and the American Nazi Party were really at odds, because for Klansmen who considered themselves patriotic, they thought it would be people had trouble with swastikas and the idea of sort of being in the same room with the enemy from World War II. But after Vietnam, this betrayal by the government narrative really becomes an engine that brings people in. And it is that way because that was a narrative that was widely adopted throughout American society as kind of the way of telling what happened in the Vietnam War. So this idea about not being allowed to win, that came from, everywhere from Hollywood to Ronald Reagan, as well as from these groups. That really also got blown up into a big cultural moment in the 90s with the militia movement, which brought in a whole bunch of other people. So the militia movement is best understood not as simply a continuation of white power, but as an overlapping, it's not a Venn diagram, because I think white power is inside the big circle of the militia movement, but the militia movement also includes a whole bunch of people who are not inside the white power movement. Does that make sense? So that is to say, one could be in the militia movement without being in the white power movement. But if you want to know where all of the weapons and money and people went from the white power movement in the 80s, and there were a lot of weapons and money and people accrued, most all went into the militia movement. So for instance, in that sedition trial with the acquittal, they returned all those weapons to the people, including the anti-tank weapons, all of that stuff went back to the people at the end of the trial. We see that stuff coming out again in the militia movement. Sorry, Kate.
I feel like that's completely crazy. Like, I feel like half of my life is me thinking that, like, the federal seizure, like the amount of stuff that the feds seize and are just kind of like forfeiture. That's it. Like that. But I mean, I guess if you come out of a trial and like you've won the trial and like like the thing being held in contemplation is a bunch of militia equipment and money, then
but remember, Kate, you grew up in a period of modern anti-terrorism laws. You know, if you go back to the early 80s, the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's people engaged in made a significant bioterrorism event in Portland, Oregon, and they were all out of prison in a few years. I mean, like the laws just operated at a completely different level of seriousness prior to the early 90s.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, Kathleen. I just was like, you said that, and I was like, really? Like, that's bonkers. And that's a good reminder, Ben. Thank you. I'm like, I am
You're a millennial.
As Popeye said, well, I'm going to make a Popeye reference, which is definitely not millennial. I was going to say, I am what I am.
Yeah.
Anyways, go ahead, Kathleen.
But I had that reaction to it too when I found it in the court record. I was like, you've got to be kidding me with this. Like, I mean, yeah, it's just really, it's really interesting, especially because one of the arguments about sort of like why these people couldn't have been guilty of seditious conspiracy was that they couldn't have succeeded. It's hard to me, it's hard to imagine needing an anti-tank weapon for anything but,
seditious conspiracy.
Waging war. So This all goes back to this bigger question about, American sovereignty and where power is meant to be located. That is maybe a down in the weeds historical question, but
we'll have you on again, and we're going to go way more into the weeds. But we have a question from Elijah, which is really wonderful, which is and like dovetails on a lot of like kind of the stuff that I've written about. And I'm kind of in the midst of trying to figure out how I feel normatively about it. Social media shaming, which is, what do you think of leftist efforts to dox, i.e., reveal the identity of members of mostly online white supremacist groups? Is the vigilante-esque nature of this kind of action worth it? Are these kinds of actions effective at suppressing white supremacist organizations? And I just want to say that beyond doxing, that there's also other things that happen at the very, very private level of these platforms. Like during Charlottesville, when it was clear that was going to be like a very like a really big rally, it was a very underreported fact that Airbnb dehomed all of the people that were like had a 4-person or more home that they had rented. So that was specifically to dehome like the white supremacists. Like they were like, we're just going to do this. I mean, they're Airbnb, they can do whatever. Like we're going to pay the people as if this transaction actually went through. But we don't want to we're going to make sure these white supremacists don't stay for 2 nights. I thought that was bonkers and no one ever really talked about it. And so It's not just doxing, it's other things. So go ahead, Kathleen.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a really complicated question because I think doxing as a thing is incredibly dangerous for all kinds of reasons, not least because sometimes people are wrong and then you've created immeasurable havoc in somebody's life. But I think this is all, what I can't stop thinking about is in my guilty pleasure read of People magazine. You read People magazine? There is now a regular section of celebrities who have said or done something racist ever. And it's like a regular feature of like so-and-so apologizing to somebody else, or so-and-so responds to the accusation, or so-and-so outs somebody. Like this is actually a big social phenomenon right now that.
Oh no, I know. Like, it's like,
I mean, like, so I make that point just to say like, this runs from activist tactics through pop culture, all the way up to the question of memorials. And I see this as part of the same question, which is fundamentally about what kind of conversation do we as a nation or a community need to have with each other about what has happened in the past and what is going to be acceptable to believe now. All of those efforts by themselves are piecemeal, right? I mean, what we need is a big coordinated conversation and a coming together around what is this really going to look like. And I think we started that work at various moments in American history. We have not finished it.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And I also kind of think that there is, for the work that I do, I try to always ask, like, what is the purpose of this policy? Like, what is the purpose? Yeah. Like, whatever the text of this policy is, or this online law is, or this law is like, what are you trying to get at? Like, what were you trying to do? And that's not like an originalist question. It's just kind of like, I think it's a pragmaticism that like people don't bring to a lot of these really hard questions. And I think that we will. Kathleen, please come on again. Talk to us about this again. Sure. We didn't even get to talk about monuments, really. I didn't get to talk to you enough about women in these kind of white supremacist movements, which I'm like really darkly fascinated with. I just like, I want to know what that looks like.
Can I suggest too that one of the other things that we could be thinking about as a society instead of doxing is de-radicalization as a real option. There are people doing that work. They're incredibly underfunded and undersupported.
What do you mean by that? Say what you mean by de-radicalization.
Well, so one option, if you encounter someone in this ideology, is confrontation. And I would broadly put doxing in that column. Another option is something that I think is a lot more difficult, but has worked. We can look at this story. There's a great Eli Saslow book about one case where this worked, where through conversation, somebody came out of the white power movement and is now, you know, back in society.
Including, and there's a famous case of the son of, what's his name, Black, who founded.
That's the story. This is the story of Derek Black, who's the son of Don Black, who is one of the leaders.
And Derek Black, if I recall correctly, I was super moved by the way, you know, the way he came out of the movement, which really actually began not with an argument or somebody confronting him, but with somebody he was in college with inviting him over for Friday night dinner, you know, sort of a, right, a sort of.
Can you guys tell me this story? I don't know it.
Kathleen, you clearly know it better than I do, so.
Well, I mean, I think you might want to talk to him or to people that are doing the de-radicalization work, but I think, you know, the story is sort of that people talked to him about his beliefs over shared meals until he began to question the basis of what he believed. And he was somebody who was sort of the heir apparent of the movement and found a way out. I mean, finding a way out is not an easy thing either. And there's the way that making people feel under attack makes that less and less possible. So I worry about strategies like doxing because of the future it forecloses.
I agree completely with that.
I want to hold out hope that there is a different future that could be pursued. The other thing is like, you know, Cynthia Miller Idris, who has a great book coming out about this soon, talks about things like, you know, in Germany, your first call, if you think your teenage son is going down the rabbit hole with these groups, your first call is to a specialized office that is just for this, just for, I'm worried that my kid is getting radicalized and is pursuing this ideology. What can I do? The first call in the United States is usually to a carceral somebody. It's police or FBI or maybe the school principal, but usually to under-resourced and highly punitive places. We don't have an apparatus for actually talking to these people, and we need one.
Yeah, I want to say that I think that there is this huge disconnect on, at least in the left, between acknowledging how completely rotted out and systemically racist the prison system is, which I completely agree with and totally think we need to reform. And then taking that idea of like, why do we have punishment? What is our punishment for? And trying to like apply this idea of reform and then this idea of mob justice shaming that they are also equally willing to engage. Like a lot of people on the left are equally willing to engage in. And like, I don't even think that's not even true of race necessarily at all. It could be completely just about, you know, it could be between two different, like, it could be about the Me Too movement or whatever else, but there is a mob justice shaming on this one hand, and this also idea that we should have a rehabilitation system on the other and a reconciliation system on the other. And they're not bridging the two. And like, no one's talking about how the mob justice thing is just like really like counteracting or like bad for, I don't know, like just not helping the idea of rehabilitation and everything else.
Yeah.
We're going to need to leave it there. Kathleen, come back, join us again, and bring Derek Black. I would.
You could get a couple of people. There's some other people who might love to join that conversation, so maybe we could make it a bigger conversation.
I would love to do that, and we can go longer than an hour if we need to. I find Derek Black's story remarkable and moving, and would love to chat with him. Thank you so much for joining us.
You bet.
Kathleen, it was so great to see you.
So tomorrow it is Saturday, so it is just Kate and me. We'll plan the show for the week. I think we've got a whole lot of people lined up for next week already, but we haven't assigned them days, so we'll send some text messages and assign them days. And Sunday, it's a mystery guest day.
You're a mystery guest.
It's my mystery guest. I haven't lined up a mystery guest yet.
Wow.
So I will need to get on that. And until tomorrow, what do we say to all the white supremacist women out there, Kate Klonick?
Just make fun, or in lieu of fun, if you can't have fun, come hang out with us and just keep making bunt cake.
Yeah, I'm actually happy for them not to come hang out with us, but to all the rest of you,
no, we just talked about their slow integration of being exposed to friendly opposing thought.
That's
but
right.
Yes.
So come here for your friendly opposing thought and bring your baked goods. We will see you